Hello and a very warm welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. Well, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar and Defence Minister Rajnath Singh held the third edition of the 2+2 talks with US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Defence Secretary Mark Esper. Both sides were assisted by top military and security officials. The Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement was signed during the dialogue. This allows both countries to share sensitive information regarding satellite and sensor data. Pompeo said after talks that the two countries had to work together to confront the threat China posed to security and freedom. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the takeaways from the 2+2 dialogue. Joining me on the program today are Jitendra Nath Misra, former ambassador, Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, foreign affairs expert, and Major General Ravi Arora, retired defense analyst. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you. We'll leave, of course, BECA for the general to take on a little later on in the program. But as far as the 2+2 dialogue as a whole was concerned, how would you look at it?
Well, I look at it as a very comprehensive dialogue. It's not just about defense. It's not just about foreign affairs. It's also about health, education, people-to-people contacts, the broad spectrum of ties. You just mentioned, Frank, first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me on the program. I forgot that. But you mentioned China. And if you look at this document, the joint statement that was issued at the conclusion of the 2+2 talks, there is no mention of China in the joint statement. But there is an implicit recognition of the situation that has arisen from China's extremely expansionist and I would say extremely aggressive posturing in its periphery and beyond. And there are many things that the document talks about in that respect. So on the one hand, this is a step forward because this dialogue is the third in the series. On the other hand, there is a greater recognition and a greater urgency of the implicit, as I said, recognition of China's, the threat emanating from China to the region, not just India, but to the entire region. And to that extent, the construct of the Indo-Pacific is now getting more and more flesh and blood. It's gelling into something much more concrete, something much more tangible. And we have to see this in the context of what's happening. And you see, it's not just India, it's Australia, it's Vietnam, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Taiwan, everywhere, Europe, including the United Kingdom, even Germany is talking of the Indo-Pacific now, France, of course. And the entire world is now coming to recognize that the rise of China, which was supposed to be peaceful and benign, is not the case. And of course, we have our own individual concerns. But India is very prudent and very realistic, and that's why there's no mention of China in this document. And it's talking about our bilateral ties and the regional and multilateral ties. The mention of the Indo-Pacific is very prominent, as you know, in this, and about secure and safe sea lanes of communication and a free, open, inclusive, peaceful, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. That's a very important part. The other thing is the mention of the Central Command. You see, there is a difference between the construct of the Indo-Pacific as far as India sees it and the United States sees it. India sees the Indo-Pacific extending to the coast of Africa. The United States has traditionally seen it up to the Bay of Bengal and not further west. Now, there will be cooperation between the Central and African commands of the United States and India. The Central Command cooperation had started, but Africa is something new as far as I know. So therefore, this is conceptually and geographically and strategically a major breakthrough. And of course, we are talking about defense trade. And I hope that the defense trade initiative will get some flesh and blood, and we will see actual transfers of technology and constructions of defense platforms in India as joint ventures. And the defense minister, in his statement, did mention that, Atmanirbhar Bharat. And the external affairs minister, in his individual statement, is talking about security becoming a very important component of the foreign policy dialogue between the two countries. And that's why we have 2+2 ministerial. Meaning earlier it was a foreign policy dialogue with the ministers of commerce during the Obama administration. That has progressed to a foreign policy and defense dialogue and security dialogue, which is
Right.
what External Affairs Minister is talking about. I'll stop here and I have more to say, but much later.
Right. All right. So, General, let me bring you to the picture then. Let's talk about the BECA or Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement. It has been signed. What does it mean really as far as our security and intelligence cooperation between the two countries is concerned?
Frank, BECA or the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement is only one small part of the Indo-US defense cooperation. And this is not a tangible thing which you can make out as to what progress has taken. It is only an enabling agreement, enabling the Americans to supply us with more information, particularly maps, aeronautical, geospatial, and imagery and that kind of data, for which we would otherwise have to pay, for which they may not have given to us. It is basically an agreement to supply geospatial information because more and more American hardware has come, which utilizes their geospatial information, imagery, aeronautical, hydrological data. And if they don't, since by law they cannot give to us unless the enabling agreement is there, we would have to use our own, or we would have to buy every time, or do with the kind of data our satellites, our aerial means, our surveillance and reconnaissance means generate, which may not be that accurate. We cannot exploit the complete equipment. And they are willing to give it to us free, but they wanted this agreement, which has now been signed and it has figured in the joint statement. So now they can exchange it both ways. They can exchange maps, they can exchange nautical and aeronautical data, commercial and other imagery, geophysical, geomagnetic data. And this includes sharing classified documents as well. Now, so far, this is the last of the enabling agreements which has been signed. It started with the information exchange agreement, then the logistics agreement, then the communications agreement, and now this BECA is for geospatial. So with this in place now, we can also utilize that data which they are willing to give to us free for our own cruise missiles, for our precision guided munitions which need such data. It is high quality data. We do generate our own, but for better accuracy, for pinpoint accuracy, we will be able to utilize this data. So this clears the way for much more cooperation in this field. All the foundation agreements are in place. And for example, when the communication agreement was not signed and they supplied us with the C-130s and C-17 and Apaches, they could not transfer some of the communication equipment fitted into it because until we agreed and signed, there was a fear that some information about that may be passed on to the Russians and others. We were also apprehensive. We were apprehensive on all these agreements that if we share data, it can go to the Pakistanis, for example, because they use many of the American equipments that, like for F-16, they use. So, but now both sides have matured. They've assured each other there are mechanisms in place to ensure that such kind of data will not be leaked to other parties. Of course, there is a chance always that it can happen. But now there is a trust and understanding that this will not happen. And of course, there are so many other aspects of Indo-US defense cooperation which have progressed since then. And if you'd like, I can go into it.
We'll get into it a little later on in the program. Let me bring in Sreeram Chaulia into the picture now. So what is the messaging from all of this? What is it, that we take away from this really, Sreeram Chaulia?
Well, Frank, Mike Pompeo said big things are happening. And I think one must underline big things because even the foundational defense agreements, look at the timeline. 2002 was the first one. Then long, hiatus with nothing happening, with, continued fears and mistrust and such stuff. And then suddenly, once Narendra Modi comes in, they're shedding the inhibitions, overcoming the old hesitations. And suddenly 2016, Lemova, 2018, Comcasa, 2020, BECA. So I think the signaling is, and then the Americans were very forthright. Pompeo said that India and the US now are seeing with greater clarity the threat being posed by the Chinese Communist Party to freedom and security in the region. Mark Esper said something like, we stand shoulder to shoulder against the destabilizing activities of China in the region. So I think the message is out there. And Dr. Jaishankar, our foreign minister, was asked by the press corps, is this all about China really? And is that the signaling we are doing? And then he said, it's about India and the US. And there is convergence. And he made a very important point that we need a multipolar Asia. What does it mean? Indirectly, in a diplomatic way, in a suave way, what we are saying is it is about China. And it is a central reason why this convergence is happening. As Ambassador was saying, now there's also greater urgency. I think Trump administration awoke to the China threat a little late. Until 2019, first 3 years, they were more interested in the trade deal and finding some kind of a political win for Trump over commercial concessions from Beijing. But now, after the coronavirus started, it's, I think, quite clear they're almost on an offensive now. And every day you hear some new measure by the US against China. So this new Cold War, or whatever we want to call it, is on. So I think that is the context, Frank, of this closer embrace and the tighter embrace. And the other point I wanted to make was the signaling is also to the Indian Ocean region as a whole. You see, Defense Minister Rajnath Singh mentioned that now the US Navy is going to have a liaison person on the IFC, the International Fusion Center of the Indian Ocean region that we have established recently to share information about all sea-based maritime incidents and events. And so that includes, submarines and such stuff, because the PLA Navy is encroaching and trying to grab more and more strategic space in the maritime waters. So while we have a threat at the LAC on the land side, there is a long, problem on the waters. And in fact, China is more vulnerable there because the Malacca Straits and all that. So I think we are now preparing for, a long kind of resistance to Chinese pressure and trying to apply counterbalancing pressure. And this 2+2 agreement, I see in that larger context, the world is awake to the Chinese threat. And I think India and the US are trying to capitalize on that sentiment now, because now there is no opposition in India. You remember, Frank, there was a time when people were saying, why are we, abandoning our strategic autonomy and, allying with the US, quote unquote. We are not allying. We are not a non-NATO ally. We are only a major defense partner. But we are trying to maximize it and to expand it beyond just bilateral, make it truly strategic, which means we are going to shape the region, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Indonesia. Pompeo is going, and we are supporting that initiative. Earlier, we used to be hesitant about the US being involved in our immediate neighborhood. Now we are saying the US is welcome, because together, along with other like-minded parties, we are going to create this new Asian power balance.
Points taken. All right. So let's take the discussion forward. I'm going to ask my panelists to be brief, because we spent about 15 minutes or so for our opening remarks, so that we can get concluding remarks at the end of the program as well. So, Ambassador, what does this mean for, Indo-US ties as a whole, considering that we have a massive, major US election next week?
Well, it's a positive sign. And I would just like to, before I answer that, may I just revisit the point that also I was going to make. Professor Chaulia said that the External Affairs Minister said the need for a multipolar Asia-Pacific is as important as a need for a multipolar world. He made it very clear there can be no multipolar world unless Asia-Pacific, which is a very large component of that world, is also multipolar. And he said it beautifully. in a very strategic sense. And there was a space when Deng Xiaoping met Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi when he went to China in the 1980s. He spoke about an Asian century that includes specifically India and China and India. But today the Asian century is only a Chinese century. And even the world is largely a Chinese world as the Chinese see it. But will the world accept it as that? And now coming to your point, could you repeat the question, please?
Elections round the corner in the United States in a week's time. So what does this mean for India-US ties as a whole?
Well, there are two views about this. Two views about the elections. One view, very clearly, is that is the timing good? After all, if our relations have bipartisan support, what was the great hurry in doing this now, 7 days before the US elections? Because both the parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, support relations with India almost in the same measure, though the nuances and the differences may vary. The other view is that, well, it's precisely because there is bipartisan support that we can have this meeting now. It doesn't matter who is going to come to power. Either way, it will happen. And I will go a step further. There will be some difference in emphasis if Mr. Biden is elected president. You see, India has three options, I think, as far as I see it, with regard to China. One is to bandwagon, capitulate, which India will not do. The second is to hedge, which India will do with Biden if Biden comes to power as the president, which means India will confront China and resist China where India's core interests are being undermined, but will cooperate where possible. And the third is balancing, which is the more likely scenario if President Trump is re-elected, which means Professor Chaulia mentioned, multipolar balances. He mentioned that word. And India does not have the power. We have 1/5 Chinese economy. Let's be very honest about it. We don't have the attributes of hard power. We will get it. We will come closer in the next 20 or 30 years, but we are not there right now. So we need external balances. And that's the most likely possibility with President Trump. There is a point of view that President Trump is very transactional. Right. But I would say that presidents have evolved. Look at the history of the United States. They evolve in the second term. And he may not be so transactional. I don't think he would be, given the way China is frighteningly becoming so assertive.
Absolutely. All right. So since we are talking so much about China, General, your views about, China's presence in the Indo-Pacific, about India's, common goals in the Indo-Pacific, and how we are going to cooperate and coordinate in this particular region.
Well, even the joint statement talks a lot about joint exercises, military to military cooperation. I consider this all to be a public relations military exercise. Whether you call it joint patrolling in certain areas, passage exercises, or the Malabar series of exercises where now Australia will also join next month, or Yudhabhyas with the army, or joint exercises for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. They call it Tiger Triumph, and all these. The second is the co-development and co-production, that is the Defense Technology Initiative, DTTI, Defense Technology and Trade Initiative. That also is not going anywhere. Just last October, we had a meeting of the DTTI, and where we decided that 3 of the old projects will be dumped and 7 more projects will be taken up. 3 in the short term, which meant 6 months, 2 in the midterm, 2 in the long term. Those short-term projects haven't even taken off. So there are a number of problems there. But the biggest tangible indication of defense cooperation is defense sales. Now, this is where American interests lie. This is where our interests lie, particularly looking at where China is going. Since 2008, when there was negligible defense sales, today the Americans have sold us $20 billion worth of hardware. And just in the last 1 year, we have got $3.8 billion worth of hardware. That includes the MR-60 Romeo helicopters, the Apache helicopters, and some large aircraft infrared countermeasures. They are also offering the F-21 against a multi-role aircraft requirement. They've offered the F-18 Super Hornet for the naval requirement, and they are offering the F-15 experimental for our future aircraft needs. They have also, not known to others, they have also cleared $3 billion worth of other military equipment which was controlled. This is, commercial sales which require their licensing and clearance, but of course, no longer. Now we are designated as, equal to NATO allies and tier one authorization. So these were in the fields of military electronics, fire control, laser, imaging. Many of these technologies were controlled. So just imagine in the last 3 years alone, about $6 billion worth, and in the last 12, 13 years, $20 billion worth has come. We have been designated as a major defense partner. We have been designated as equal to a NATO ally. The legislation is going through. But now with this joint statement, they have also declared that there will be a military cooperation group. It is now possible to do that because all the agreements are in place, which will review military cooperation every year as to where it is going, because the passage has been opened for greater military cooperation. Of course, there is a lot of give and take. Give and take, for example, in the Quad itself. India was shy of joining the Quad, but I'm sure with now more openness to being seen as part of the Quad, India must have demanded and got their say in many of the things. So you will find now much more cooperation in the military fields. We have no choice. The way the world is going, seeing China's aggressiveness in Asia, in Ladakh, and all its borders, we have not much of a choice but to go along.
Okay, all right. Sreeram, Chaulia, so where are the ties headed really in the near future?
Frank, whether it is Joe Biden administration or Donald Trump administration, the groundswell, the foundational support for India is very high in the American public opinion, as well as in the Congress and in the strategic establishment, career bureaucracy, diplomatic corps. So I think in that sense, we have now reached a stage where, sky is the limit. And there are, of course, issues which remain with regard to trade. Trump tariffs and they have not yet been removed. And we would like some kind of a resolution to that as quickly as possible, at least a phase one type of agreement. And then, there are some geopolitical issues where we have had problems in the past. For example, the sanctions, the maximum pressure campaign of the US on Iran under Trump administration really limited our expansion through the Chabahar port and our link up with Central Asia and all that. So I think there are, and then they were objecting to the S-400 purchase from Russia as well. It's always the case with the US because it's a great power, so they have varied interests in different regions, and sometimes those impinge upon choices of partners. But I think we are playing the smart game, which is to pool our resources with the capable powers, including the US, but not exclusively the US. And we are going in a direction where we want also, the global supply chain. That is one of the big points mentioned. And Frank, the future really is to contain China or to stop China lies not only in the military domain, but in economics, because the Chinese juggernaut is essentially a commercial one. That's how they've tried to take over the entire global South in Africa and Latin America and Asia. And to put up a joint front, infrastructure development, that is one area it was mentioned today in the 2+2 dialogue, that the Blue Dot initiative of the US with Japan, we have a partnership for quality infrastructure. I think the connectivity, if we come up with, we strengthen the Asia-Africa growth corridor, which we are doing with Japan, with the US also heavily involved. If we actually combine, this is really the time for what Dr. Jaishankar and Prime Minister Modi promote, which is a plurilateral approach, because small groups of like-minded countries, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, quad plus, I think that's the way forward. The US will remain, but given the peculiarities of the US and the shift sometimes in policies, whenever there's a change in administration, we need to make sure that our eggs are spread out, and I think we are doing the right thing. So the US is central, but not exclusively the only one option for us.
Okay. Very, very limited time on the program, so I'm going to ask my panelists to be very brief in their concluding remarks in 30 seconds each, the best way forward, starting first with you, Ambassador.
The best way forward is to engage in all areas, not just in diplomatic, not just in foreign policy, the hard areas like security and defense. We have education, we have $7 billion being earned by the US from Indian students, for example. And we should not worry about who's coming to power in the United States. And we will carry forward this relationship. But there will be differences. There will be differences, as Professor Chaulia said, and we have to navigate those differences very carefully.
General?
The kind of threats we are facing today, we have not faced in the past because China has shown its hand. And if we are to be strong, we cannot take on China, Pakistan, and other belligerent countries who are backing them until we have the support from the Americans. And now the Americans are willing to provide that support. We must take maximum advantage out of it.
All right. And Sreeram, Chaulia, close the show for us with a quick concluding remark.
Well, China has been put on notice. They've already reacted saying that India has emerged as one of the lovers of the US, and it will actually not get anything except a token support from the US. But I think we are smarter than that. We are not falling for the trap of dividing India from the US or from other partners. We know where our national interests lie, and we are pursuing them this time without any compunctions or hesitations. This is actually a more decisive India. And that is the reason, and Atmanirbhar Bharat, and we are doing it in a way which makes sure that our adversaries know there is a cost to aggression. We are raising the cost to Chinese aggression through our diplomacy.
Okay, on that note, then I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this discussion is that the 2+2 dialogue was all about India and the United States. There was no direct mention of China in the joint declaration, but the threat emanating out of China has been very strongly noticed. Mention of the Indo-Pacific was very clear. Both nations are very particular about a free and open Indo-Pacific and also want to ensure freedom of navigation of the seas. BECA is just a part of a much bigger defense and strategic cooperation between the two nations. And India enjoys bipartisan support in the United States. So the results of the US elections don't matter too much. Whoever comes to power, Indo-US ties will be on an upward trajectory. With that, it's a wrap. See you again next time.